Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for Gamma's, I think, 7th annual GeoInsurance webinar series. My name is Richard Garry. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer with Gamma, and I'll be your host today. For those that don't know Gamma, we provide data like flood, subsidence, domestic fire, crime, demographic data that can help an underwriter make an informed decision or price the risk more accurately. Gamma have also developed AddressLink, our property level data enrichment database that includes variables like building size, height, age, number of rooms, and we have up to 50 variables for Irish property. We combine some of these variables to also provide home rebuild costs and reinstatement value as well. Both our hazard and peril data and AddressLink can be provided through web services or consumed within our GeoInsurance map visualization solution, Peril Finder. This past year has been quite busy for us as we were acquired by CatRisk, a US catastrophe modeling company that specializes in flood risk, amongst other things. We have also been quite busy building out Peril Finder for North America as a result, and we'll be adding loads more functionality to the platform over the coming months, including events modules and reporting dashboards to allow users greater policy insights. Once developed, all of this functionality will be available this side of the pond as well. So before we just jump into the actual webinar itself, a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, so we'll be sharing the recording afterwards as well. So you get an email that will have a link to the recording. If you have any questions, you can submit those in the Q&A tab, which is at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to address as many of these as possible at the end, time permitting. So our aim with GeoInsurance has always been to present the latest science and developments in geospatial and climate change that affect or might be of interest to the insurance sector in Ireland. With this in mind, we have 3 interesting presentations today to discuss a wide range of topics, from coastal flooding to domestic fire, climate change and CAT modeling. So we've been joined today by Charlotte Cuff, who's the Chief Data Scientist at Gamma, Brandon Katz, who's the Executive VP of Strategy with KatRisk, and Richard Cantwell, who's the Head of Spatial and Sustainability with Gamma. Our first speaker today is Charlotte. Charlotte's going to bring us through and provide some insights from a recent report on England's fire and rescue services, which cover over 450,000 fires in England. I think a lot of the findings will have applications here due to the similarities between the UK and Ireland. So I might hand over to you there, Charlotte.
Thank you, Richard. Hello, everyone. Am I still sharing? Yes. My name is Charlotte Cuff. I'm Chief Data Scientist here at Gamma, and today I'll be talking about some risk insights that we pulled by analysing data on dwelling fires in England over the past 15 years. So the data that we're looking for, as I said, comes from England. It comes from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. It covers the period from financial year 2010-2011 to financial year 2024-25. We looked at dwelling fires, so that is fires in occupied or unoccupied houses, bungalows, cottages, flats, apartments, etc. Now similar data sets do exist for fires in commercial premises and outdoor fires, but today we are focusing on dwelling fires. Now, for each of these more than 450,000 fires, the data set records a wealth of data, 37 different pieces of information about where, when and how the fire occurred, the response by services and the aftermath, so the amount of harm that was done as a result of the fire. And then for certain fires from financial year 2017 to 2018 onwards, there's another additional dozen or so pieces of data. So it is a very rich data set. Now, there's several different variables that all relate to the magnitude or the severity of the fire. We know how far the fire had spread by the time the crew arrived. So that could be in terms of the number of rooms or the number of floors affected, whether it reached another property. We also know those things by the end of the incident, so once everything was wrapped up. We know how many vehicles and how many personnel were needed to attend the fire, and we know how long they had to spend at the scene, which obviously that's going to be related to severity also. If there were any casualties or rescues or evacuations, that's recorded too. And of course, these things are all correlated with each other. But the key variables for us are the fire damage extent and the total damage extent. Now, the difference between those is that fire damage is strictly the area that's damaged by heat, smoke, or flames, whereas the total damage is that plus the area that's damaged by any work involved in putting out the fire. So that might be breaking down a door to facilitate a rescue, or in particular, when water is used to put out a fire, that can result in a damage to a much greater area than the original fire itself. So with this analysis, we chose to focus on the total square meters of damage. Now, damage extent is reported in bands rather than as the exact value. You'll notice less than 0.1% of fires, less than 1 in 1,000, resulted in damage to more than 1,000 square meters. Now, we don't have an upper limit on the amount of damage there, so we can't make any numerical estimate. So we just exclude those from the analysis, but they are a tiny minority. The remainder of this talk, I'll be focusing on fires that caused less than 1,000 square meters of damage in total. To make these numerical comparisons, we give each fire damage band just the middle, the average value of the whole band, because this allows us to aggregate the average damage extent for different subsets of the data. And in particular, it lets us look at some of the risk factors that might be associated with greater or lesser amounts of damage. So the good news is that the average area damaged in dwelling fires, it's been steadily decreasing since the record keeping here began. In 24-25, the most recent year, the average area damaged was a third smaller than at the beginning in 2010-2011. So that is an encouraging trend. Now, we don't know exactly why this trend exists, but this data can help us to identify the risk factors that might explain some of it. Only a minority of fires were recorded as deliberate, but these resulted in about 60% more damage on average than those that were recorded as accidental. And among accidental fires, the greatest damage was associated with playing with fire. So you can imagine there might be a little ambiguity between a deliberate fire and accidentally playing with fire. Watch out for the roofs. Only 2% of fires started in the roof or roof spaces, but these were likely to do substantially more damage, the most extensive damage than those that start in other parts of the building. Speaking of roofs also, watch out for the thatch. In fact, a thatched roof was the single factor most strongly associated with more extensive damage in dwelling fires. And in fact, all types of special construction, including cladding, sandwich panels, timber framing, they were all associated with more extensive damage. Now, several of the different risk factors that we identified, they all reflect the fact that getting a fire under control quickly is critical. Fire growth is exponential, which means that the larger and hotter a fire already is, the faster it is going to grow. So they do not grow in a linear fashion. The more they grow, the quicker they grow. So any delay, anything that gives the fire more time to get established before the crew can get to it is going to be associated with greater damage. And that delay can occur at many different points. It could be between ignition and detection. It could be once it's detected, if there is a delay in making the call to emergency services, or it could be the time between making the call and the personnel actually arriving at the scene. Now, from 2017-2018 onwards, we have two more features recorded, which are time of day and vacancy status. So both of those things are related to the amount of damage that is done. Morning, afternoon, and evening fires have similar amounts of damage, but nighttime fires do about a quarter more damage on average. So possibly that is because at nighttime people are less responsive, less alert, and slower to deal with the issue, or slower to wake up and realize that a fire is happening. Occupancy is another factor. Fires in vacant properties cause 2.7 times more damage on average than fires in occupied properties. So again, if there is nobody there to notice the fire or nobody there to respond quickly, that's associated with substantially more damage. Fire alarms are another protective factor. Since 2017-2018, the type of alarm is recorded, so we can actually compare alarm types. And as it turns out, The average area damaged is smaller for fires where there was a mains-powered alarm compared to battery-powered, but either type is better than none. So to understand the difference, I think you need to look at the operation of the alarms. Mains alarms operated and raised the alarm in 65% of the dwelling fires where they were present, compared to only 47% of fires where a battery alarm was present. So given the choice, we should prefer a mains-powered alarm, but again, any type of alarm is worth having. And if you do have a battery-powered alarm, check its batteries, make sure it's working. Now, the median time from ignition to discovery is under 5 minutes, and only a small fraction of fires burn for more than 30 minutes before being discovered. Now, as well as that, there are 8% of fires where the time from ignition to discovery is actually not known. As you can see, fires that are discovered immediately or within 5 minutes result in much less damage on average than those that burn for longer before being discovered. Now, discovery to call is a somewhat interesting pattern. As you'd expect, this is usually short. Most people do, in fact, make the call immediate. But the damage pattern shows increasing damage up to 30 minutes, as you would expect, and then less damage on average when the time from discovery to call is more than 30 minutes. Now, it's possible that these are actually fires that are smaller when they're discovered, and that's why they ultimately do less damage. But this is an interesting and slightly unexpected result. Lastly, we have response time. Now, this is the time from when the call comes in to when the firefighters arrive at the scene. This is typically very, very quick. The median response time is just 6 minutes. 80% of calls have firefighters at the scene within 10 minutes and 95% within 15 minutes. So response time usually is very rapid. But the small minority of fires where the response time is longer than that do tend to result in more damage. So the takeaway there is that anyone who lives in a remote area that might be difficult to reach from the nearest fire station has an extra reason to be particularly vigilant about fire safety. So to sum up, the key to minimizing damage in dwelling fires is to get it under control before it has a chance to grow. Fire alarms are protective, especially mains-powered alarms. Delays increase the danger caused by a fire significantly. Delays might occur because the fire breaks out at night in a vacant building or the fire alarm is missing or doesn't operate. Residents of remote or rural areas far from fire stations should be particularly vigilant. Even with the fastest response, there are some types of fires that are going to be difficult to control before they do damage. That includes deliberate fires, fires in roof spaces, and fires in certain kinds of construction like thatch or timber framing that can get out of hand very quickly. That means that managing fire risk is not only a matter of the resident's behaviour, the dwelling's characteristics as a structure and its location relative to services are also key to its vulnerability or robustness against fire. If you'd like to learn more about any of this, we do have a blog post on our webpage where there's more of this analysis and a bit more depth. Lastly, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. Thank you, everyone.
That's great. Thanks for that, Charlotte. Really insightful information there. So our next up is Brandon Katz. He's the Executive VP of Strategy at KatRisk, covering climate data and catastrophe modeling. Brandon's going to take us through how climate science and change is becoming increasingly valuable in catastrophe modeling. He's going to explore what we do and don't yet know about using climate data in CAT models, from integrating climate intelligence into risk modeling to how these models are being used to address emerging regulatory requirements. So Brandon, I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Richard. And I appreciate you inviting me here to speak with this group this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. So as mentioned, I'll be talking about climate models and how they interact or don't interact and shouldn't interact with climate catastrophe models. So for those that don't know, very briefly, catastrophe modeling industry, we're fairly big in the insurance areas. And what we're doing is we're creating what I would call synthetic loss histories for any type of event from a peril standpoint, say, flooding, hurricanes, these sort of things, so that, you can figure out what's a good price for a premium or what is the risk for a given location if you're thinking things outside of the insurance industry. We do a lot of work with governments as well, looking at things like resilience. So that's just a very quick, brief introduction to that. what we're going to go through is a few slides here thinking about really what are the reliable data sources that we as climate scientists can be using. Apologies for this CAS little thing in the bottom corner there. That's from a different presentation. But going through some of the reliable data sources that we as climate scientists can be using, how those climate change data can be used within catastrophe models themselves, what we do and don't know. So that's really going to be the meat of the presentation. We're going to go through some of the reporting from the International Panel on Climate Change, which is sort of our Bible, I would say, or our prime document that we use as a statement of truth. And then talk very briefly on, why you should care, because regulation is coming in a lot of the regions that the people on this call are operating, especially in the United Kingdom. Those regulations already exist. So going through what some of those regulations are and what's coming new into the European area and theater. And then, sort of have a brief call to action where we talk about what are future topics people might be interested in speaking about and learning about. So jumping in here, so yeah, I mentioned earlier that our prime document that we've been looking at as climate scientists is the International Panel on Climate Change's documents here. So a lot of people have heard of the IPCC, but a lot of people may not realize how long the IPCC has been around. So it's been around since 1988, and since then we've had 6 total assessment reports with 6 total actual events that are taking place. So if you ever heard of the AR1, AR2, AR5, AR6, that's these assessment reports, which are these very long multi-thousand page documents that summarize and synthesize all current journals, entries, peer-reviewed science, etc., that are coming from the scientists that are being reported on by the IPCC. One interesting thing to always note about the IPCC is they are not necessarily, they are commissioning a couple studies, but for the most part, what their responsibility is going out into the market, going out into peer-reviewed journals and finding what is the most reputable, groupings of papers that we can look at and create a synthesis reports that basically says this is the state of climate science today in the world. What is updated from previous assessment reports and what is new from these assessment reports. The primary use case of these reports are to inform governments in the state of knowledge of climate change. So these are used a lot on the governmental levels to make policy decisions, think about how they should be positioning future policy positions, and to get a pulse check of where we are from a climate change perspective to see, how far down the rabbit hole have we gone, and also then what mitigations can be taken and what is the effectiveness of those mitigations. And we can use these as a catastrophe modeling industry to really take these natural and economic impacts and determine what are the actual losses associated with the book of business. So typically of structures, contents, time element losses that you'd see within the insurance industry. The additional thing that these AR reports do are societal risks. It's a relatively new thing. That's with the AR6. It's one of the reasons that you'll see the names changing as we'll go on with the slides coming in the future here, where we're also not just looking at the natural and economic impacts, which are really what we're going to be talking about the most within this presentation, but they've also gone on and began to talk about societal risks, things like famine, looking at how droughts affect crops and how then the crops and food scarcity can affect areas around the world. So just to give you a quick holistic view of what the IPCC is trying to accomplish with these. These next handful of slides are going to show how the models that the IPCC is referring to and looking through have really evolved through the years since the early 1980s. So obviously back then the computers were a little bit less sophisticated than they are now. So what we're seeing here is looking in the far bottom left corner, you can see here we've gone from the far SAR tar to the AR4. Obviously we're on the AR6 now, but they haven't released the new slate of imagery. So you'll notice it stops at AR5, but do remember we are in AR6. And you can see the resolution of these models has been increasing over time, as indicated by the models in the bottom left, and the complexity of what's being modeled has increased significantly, going all the way from the 1970s to the AR5 models. So it used to be what we could learn about was things like sea level rise and what is the temperature of the ocean, temperature of the air, but now we're going into things like thinking about the carbon cycle, atmospheric chemistry, how is land ice and how are the clouds interfacing with global warming. We have this interesting effect where modeling high clouds versus low clouds tells you information about whether heat gets trapped more or less. It gets reflected away through sunlight, as an example. So a lot of these really complex couple of climate models, and you can see here again, as I mentioned, how these things are improving with time. Now, many people have probably heard of the RCP scenarios. That's the AR5, as you can see in the left middle there. That's the representative concentration pathways. It's giving us different scenarios for how carbon is released into the atmosphere. And now with the AR6, we have the shared socioeconomic pathways. That's, as I mentioned, as we get more complex and we're taking into account some of the societal impacts as well of these scenarios. And one of the reasons you probably see more often than not in regulatory filings that the RCP scenarios are required is because they spend a little more time looking at things from a socioeconomic, from an economic point of view. So how are the natural catastrophe models actually impacting the economics, which is why in a lot of the regulatory filings for the insurance industry, banking industry, et cetera, that are more concerned with buildings, that's why a lot of times the RCPs are being used as opposed to the SSP scenarios, even though they're a bit newer. And a lot of that also is that the SSP scenarios are a bit newer, and so the regulatory rate filings are still catching up to the latest science. Next slide just goes to a little bit more to show how complex these models are, especially looking at the CMIP6, which is the coupled model intercomparison project. So these number 6 also corresponds to the ARs. So this is the most recent one. This is where I mentioned that we're also looking at a lot of really interesting I would say physical risks within here too, thinking about impacts of certain scenarios, looking at, as I mentioned, some of the drought indicators and how those things deal with climate and crops. Even going down to look at the bottom, if you look at the left image, the bottom middle, geoengineering solutions. So these are things that people have been thinking about doing for, as an example, how can we manage the fact that our climate is warming? One of the oldest examples of geoengineering is putting aerosols into the atmosphere, typically sulfates. It's the same concept as when you have volcanoes erupting and you put sulfates up in the atmosphere. It actually cools the global temperatures because those little particles reflect more sunlight. And this can even get as crazy as some of the more recent proposals that have been out there where we can deploy large mirrors into space and reflect 0.01% of the solar radiation coming into the atmosphere. Supposedly that's something that can reduce the temperature on the Earth. So as you can see, the CMIP6 and the AR6 gets much more complex, and it's taking into account some things beyond just the normal physical characteristics of what's happening in our atmosphere. So again, this is just all going to show that these models are very complex and are getting more and more complex over time. So what are some of the data sources that we as climate scientists in the catastrophe modeling industry can be using? Obviously, we've already talked a lot about the IPCC. It's been around since the 1980s. We have our scientific peer-reviewed journals. I'll give some more examples of that on the next slide. And then we have all of our government entities that are incredibly important data vendors for us to be able to take data from. And I'll get a little soapbox here in a minute about the importance of being able to fund these organizations here in the next slide. But anyone that's in science would probably recognize the vast majority of these scientific journals, but I could probably spend 150 slides or so just talking about all the different scientific journals that are out there, some that are better, some that are worse. But these are some of the ones that you'll see the most often. You have the American Meteorological Society, we have Nature, Wiley, Springy, Elsevier, really popular international journals. And then getting into the government entities, it goes beyond obviously what I'm most familiar with here in the U.S. We can get information from, the European Space Agency, ESA, the Met Office in the United Kingdom are incredibly important data sources. We have information from the Japan Meteorological Society and all around. So these government entities, without the data that we get from these government entities, the models that we build, not only from a climate perspective, but also from a cat modeling perspective of the current climate, really couldn't be created and maintained. So these are incredibly important entities that we have to make sure that in the US, I think this is less of a problem where most of you sit in the UK, but it's incredibly important that we continue to fund these organizations. Without these satellite data, telemetries, and without some of the information that we get from gauges, et cetera, managed by them, we really couldn't do the work that we do. Speeding right along, looking at climate change and catastrophe models. So this is really getting more into the meat of the conversation. So one of the questions one might ask are, what is the data that we're using in CAT models? And then the next question is, how is that data then being integrated? I'm not going to spend a wealth of time on these slides because they're more looking at the global picture. But one of the things I like to do with this presentation, and it should be shared with you all as well, is to give you the ability to take some of these presentations that are being shown and use them for yourselves. Use them for your own reports. And so I've made sure to add the actual links you'll see within this presentation to every single location where I'm getting these maps from. And what you're seeing here is the assessment report 5, the AR5 RCP scenarios, and it's showing on the right side, it's getting from general to more specific on the left side. So on the right, we're getting a picture of how is atmospheric CO2, which is the primary greenhouse gas that is anthropogenic. So we as humans are putting it up at increased rates. We have the RCP 8.5 in the upper right, which is the most worst case scenario that we had envisioned in AR5. But as you'll see in the more recent AR6, that's the path that we're currently going on. So unfortunately, most of the new scenarios really spring from the RCP 8.5 as opposed to really assuming that we're going to have a better case scenario. So we're already going down sort of the worst path, unfortunately. And we can see that by the year 2100, we're seeing, around a 2 centigrade change in global temperatures that we'll see from the RCP 8.5. And obviously, this goes up to the year 2500, but this is really getting a bit more certain. And as you'll see, as we go to the left side, we kind of look more at that year, that 100-year horizon, where we're only looking to the year 2100, because that's really where you have the least amount of uncertainty in these models. Global mean sea surface rise. We'll talk about that with more specifically to the United Kingdom and the areas in Europe in the preceding slides. So I won't go into some of those sea level rise scenarios. But you can see by the year 2100, if we look at the middle images, that we're looking at somewhere around a 0.8 or so meters increase in global sea level rise. And then the left side, you can see here, it gives you a better idea geographically where we're seeing some of those temperature increases and how much for precipitation, sea surface temperature and temperature, as well as sea level rise. Looking at the AR6, so the more recent reports, as you would probably not be surprised, you can see these are getting more complex because they're trying to take into account a lot more things. Again, the socioeconomic impacts of climate change. But the punchlines here is that what you're seeing is that the global sea, and we won't go through each one of these images. This is more free to look at your leisure. But the punchline, if you kind of search through these images, is that the sea level rise has been fairly consistent between AR5 and AR6. So the sea level rise is still by the year 2100 looking at a 0.8 to 1 meter or so sea level rise, but the temperature scenarios have really gotten much worse because they're all following that RCP 8.5 scenario. So the vast majority of what we're looking at, again, is that sort of worst path that we're going on right now. So that's mostly why I want to show this image, to show that these things are getting more complex. Sea surface temperature has been fairly well understood over time, or sea surface rise, I should say, has been fairly well understood over time. And that picture has remained fairly consistent. And you'll see as we get to these later slides, when we mention what do we know with low, medium, or high confidence, that the sea surface rise has been fairly consistent. So now we've discussed what all the different parameters are. So the main parameters for CAT models are things like land temperature, sea surface temperature, sea level rise, and changes in precipitation patterns. And now the question is, how do these things get integrated into CAT models? These are the primary 6 NatCat perils. There's also, of course, earthquake, which is less affected by climate change. So we won't speak about that during this presentation. But we have inland flood, tropical cyclone, surge and wind, severe convective storm, which includes hail, straight line wind, and tornado, wildfire, and winter storm. So I'm going to briefly go through, when you're thinking about these NatCat perils, how that data we just discussed is integrated and how we modify an inland flood model to be looking at future climate change scenarios. So for inland flood, what we're doing is we're looking at how precipitation is going to be changing regionally. So this is not a global parameter where you say all floods are now 20% more likely. Actually, things are very, very different depending on where you are within a given country, within a given region. So with inland flood, what we're doing is we're modifying return periods. All of our maps and all of our loss models are based off of these return period flood maps. So at the 10, 20, 50, 100, 200, 500 year as an example. And what we're doing is we're saying that a 100-year return period event, which is all the severity that you would associate with that, now occurs much, much earlier in time. So say at an 80-year return period. So we're doing return period shifting, which has implications both on the frequency and the severity. Tropical cyclone wind is used as a percent change. So we're saying now all wind speeds are, say 20% higher or 10% higher. Tropical cyclone surge is computed by changes in sea surface rise. So if your whole sea surface of a given area is, say 10, 20 centimeters higher, that means all the surge events that happen in that area are not going to be 10, 20 centimeters higher. Severe convective storm, as you'll see, is very much less known. And so we don't do as much with severe convective storm because the science there isn't as settled in terms of how climate change is going to be affecting SCS. This includes European windstorm. But we would do that with a percent change similar to tropical cyclone wind. Wildfire is very interesting. That's a more unique one where those wildfires are now going to burn more frequently and burn longer. So the way we could typically create wildfire models is you burn them for X number of days. But in our model, we allow them to burn longer so that we can model those effects of climate change. So our base set will have wildfires burning to 100% of the time that we expect it to, but maybe with climate change scenarios, then it burns 120% time as opposed to 100% time. So basically, you're just allowing those wildfires to burn a bit longer with climate change events and to happen more frequently. And winter storm, similar to SCS, has a very low certainty in how winter storm is going to interact, except for the fact that we do know we're going to have less cold days, and therefore the presence of snow and snow loading, we do expect those things to decrease over time. But it's more of a wholesale change as opposed to geographic changes. So that's giving you a quick general view. Checking time, got about 10 minutes left. So this is the last handful of really important slides I want to go to, so I'm going to slow down here and spend a little bit more time on this. So when you look at some of these images here, these are from the executive summaries. That's one of the nice things about these papers. They might be thousands and thousands of pages long, but they want to make sure that regulators and government officials can spend the time to read, digest, and really understand the main impacts. So they've created these really good summary images. And what we're seeing here in the next two slides after this one is looking at what are some of the top line answers, what are some of the top line results that you're getting from these IPCC synthesis reports. And the area that we're operating in, we're looking in here is the NEU, which is a Northern Europe area. That includes the United Kingdom, it includes Ireland, it also includes parts of Scandinavia. And what we're seeing here is that each one of these hexagons tells you the region, the number of dots tells you the severity of the change, as well as the certainty of the change. So you can see here that everything is red, which means they're increases. And in the NEU, we have a high, so 3 dots, high degree of certainty that we will be seeing increases in hot extremes in the Northern European theater. Other areas like, for instance, CAF, which is Central Africa, which is gray. Sometimes if it's there's not sufficient data that we can use to make any sort of assertion, that's when the circle is hollow. So 1 dot means low certainty of any change. A hollow dot means not enough data to make any assertion. So just to give you that quick information. Moving on to the next slide. There we go. Heavy precipitation. You can see that in Northern Europe, we're expecting to see a large increase in heavy precipitation. What's interesting about Northern Europe is that we see not just an increase in total precipitation, but we're also seeing an increase in extreme precipitation, which you're not seeing in this image, but you'll see in a future image. And that means that in Northern Europe, we're expecting floods to be much more extreme in the future, both from a pluvial, which is the sort of flash flood type component, and the fluvial, which is the river overtopping component of flood. So we're expecting with future climate change to see some fairly serious implications for the Northern European theater. Lastly, just because I think it's interesting to look at, this is all coming from the AR6, as I mentioned before. So like from a socioeconomical standpoint, just because I think it's interesting and it's important for us to notice is that we are seeing relatively no change to agriculture. I would say low confidence of any change in the Northern European Union area. So ecological drought and agricultural drought is expected to be fairly minimal throughout the United Kingdom and the NEU. Moving on to these slides. So these are looking at sort of the global picture a little bit more clearly here. And then the next slides I'll be getting more into Northern Europe specifically. So these are going to be very hard to read. So if you'll just allow me the courtesy of telling you what we're seeing here is what we're looking at is we're seeing a high, whatever you see the sizes of the bars and the directionality of the bars, if they're going up or down, up means increase, down means decrease. And the solid color of the bars tells you high confidence. If it's a shaded bar, it gives you low confidence. If there's no shading, it tells you it's basically no confidence. So what we're seeing here is we know that for those two that you're seeing cold spells and frost events have a high degree of certainty globally to decrease. We're seeing that riverine flood and heavy precipitation has a sort of medium, I would say, confidence of getting worse over time. And of course, regionally, these things are more certainty. They have more certainty. You'll see that in later slides when we're looking at the European area more specifically. Again, this is global. Fire weather has some, I would say, medium to low confidence of how it's changing globally. But again, in some areas, you're going to see very high certainty of changing. In the Western United States, as an example, is a high degree of change, a high certainty that there's going to be worse wildfire weather. But again, this is the global picture. Severe weather has very low certainty. We mentioned that before, so we don't expect to know very much about severe storms or tropical cyclone activity. That's because tropical cyclone is actually an interesting one. I'll just very briefly mention that the idea there is that we are seeing increases in sea surface temperature, which is more fuel for hurricanes. So that would imply that hurricanes should be getting worse. But we're also seeing increases in what's called vertical wind shear, which is how winds change as you go up in the atmosphere, which kills hurricanes, gets rid of that strong vertical structure of hurricanes. So that's why there's sort of not that much confidence in how tropical cyclones themselves are going to be changing. And then we get into heavy snowfall, hail, and snow avalanche. Those are expected to have very low confidence in change. And finally, things like coastal flood and relative sea level have, as we mentioned before, extremely high degree of certainty in how those things are going to get worse. So we might not know whether hurricanes are going to get worse or better. Maybe they stay the same, but because sea level rise is going to be higher, that means that any given surge event is going to be much worse. Now we're going to get more into Europe. So how do those things translate into Europe? So within Europe itself, we're seeing heat, malnutrition, and harm from wildfire increasing with medium certainty. That's the 2 dots. And we're seeing the floods increasing throughout. Again, this is all Europe-wide with low to medium certainty with those increasing through Europe. This last slide, really kind of not last slide, but probably speed through the next one after this one. Gives you some more information about just looking at the Northern European region. Again, that's looking at the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Scandinavia. So what we're seeing here is that we're seeing a high confidence with the 1.5 and 4.0 degrees C future climate change scenarios using the SSP6, SSP scenarios from AR6. We're seeing a high degree of certainty that heat extremes are going to increase, a high degree of certainty that cold extremes will decrease. Mean precipitation has medium to high confidence that's going to be increasing, but heavy precipitation has a much higher degree of likelihood to increase in the United Kingdom. Droughts have little certainty. Severe weather windstorms have a small degree, very low confidence of increasing within the Northern European theater. And sea level driven, so coastal flooding is expected with a high degree of certainty to increase in the Northern European seas. So again, we're trying to focus in now more on the region for the topic of this conversation, which is the Northern European theater specifically. And again, the other thing I've done here is you'll notice this, there's a link to this big report. It's a half a gigabyte, so this is the 1,000-page report. But what I've tried to do here as well is also specify which page numbers for you. So you can, again, you can use this as a reference for your own reports and your own internal presentations. So if you want to get these images directly out of the report, there's the link to the report and the pages from which I'm getting these images. On the right side, you're getting even more nitty-gritty. So down to the grid cell location, you can see the mean sea level rise around the United Kingdom and Ireland is fairly minimal, but also not insignificant. So we will see increases in coastal flooding within Ireland and the United Kingdom. And you see the precipitation days for the more extreme events. That's the events in the right column versus the less extreme climate change scenarios on the left column. You can see that the extreme precipitation, maximum 1-day precipitation, which is extreme precipitation, is increasing significantly throughout the southern United Kingdom and Ireland. And that image on the bottom right. So last main slide, this is really just getting direct quotes from the IPCC. Again, these have the page numbers below. So I'm just going to read these. So risks of inundation and extreme flooding will increase with the accelerating pace of sea level rise along Europe's coast with high confidence. And again, these are just direct quotes. Risk of increase of Northern European in the Northern European theater for extreme precipitation has a medium to high confidence. There's a high confidence that increases in extreme precipitation in Ireland. For surge, flood risks along Europe's low-lying coasts and estuaries will increase due to sea level rise compounded by storm surges, rainfall, and river runoff with high confidence. So again, this is saying that those flood impacts are going to be high with high confidence. Risks of increases in Northern European for coastal flooding due to sea level rise, pardon that typo, high confidence. and a high confidence in medium increases in sea level rise within Ireland specifically. For a tropical cyclone, for a severe convective storm, projections for the 21st century show increases in storms across all of Europe with medium confidence with a decrease in their frequency. So worse storms happening less frequent. Low confidence in changing of severe windstorms in the Northern European area. For winter storm, increase in hot days and decrease in cold days, very likely. So that's high confidence. And decreases in cold days are very likely. That's also high confidence in Northern Europe. And finally, for fire, fire-prone areas are predicted to expand across Europe, threatening biodiversity and carbon sinks. So medium confidence, that's across Europe. And in Northern Europe, though, there is a fairly low to medium confidence and increased risk. So these fire-prone areas are more like in your Spain and Portugal and areas in the south where you should see increased wildfire probability. With that, I'll very briefly mention some of the regulation. So we have Solvency II is coming as basically Solvency II Pillar 2, I should say. Obviously, Solvency is already there across Europe, so they're increasing some of the regulatory requirements. Obviously, we already have the TCFD and the Prudential Regulatory Authorities, TCFD, within the United Kingdom. We've been supplying a lot of data from that from KatRisk for the people to be able to do those regulatory filings since its inception. And all of our models are climate aware and able to take in all these climate events and be able to model them and use for regulatory filings. So it's a lot of regulation already in the UK itself and Ireland. Other areas are having these things already coming or already in place. Australia has some very similar PRA type things. You can see it's the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority as opposed to just the PRA that we have in the UK. And then in the United States, we have the NAIC that's pushing some climate risk disclosures that are currently stuck in the SEC in legal filings. But we've heard tell on some fairly strong contacts that some states in the United States may go ahead and start actually implementing some of the very similar to PRA TCFD in the United States within California, New York, and Illinois in the near future. So states may go ahead and take some of these regulatory filings under their wing and implement them themselves, even if the whole country as a whole does not do these regulatory filings in the near future. So with that, I was going to ask with I live in Texas, so what you interested in? So are there future topics that you'd like to discuss that we could think about for future seminars? How is climate change actually used within insurance companies? One question I get a lot is why do insurance companies care? They typically have 1-year policies. The answer's relatively complicated, but we can go into some of those conversations. How is it actually affecting insurance policies today? Things about climate change liability insurance. What topics are interesting and salient for you all that we could talk about in future webinars? And with that, please feel free to send me an email or anybody on this call, Richard or Charlotte, to ask us any questions, and we can make sure to talk to you all about how these climate models are interacting. So with that, I will stop sharing and toss it back over to Richard. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Brandon. That was very informative. Learned a lot from that. Some really fantastic insights. So we're sort of building on what Brandon said there. We've got a poll that should be popping up somewhere on the screen. So before we move on just to the next session, I'd like you to get some of your feedback on what maybe what you'd like to see in future GeoInsurance webinars. It's your chance to let us know what you think can help shape these future events. So yeah, hopefully that's popped up somewhere on your screens. Maybe just take a moment to review those. So while you're doing that, I'll introduce our next presentation, and this is building on some of the points that Brandon mentioned there about coastal flooding and getting worse in these islands. So Richard Cantwell, our head of spatial analytics at Gamma, will guide us through the latest findings from a report that we wrote here at Gamma on coastal flooding. So a white paper, which was published there just a few weeks ago, I think. The report found that a single extreme coastal flood scenario across Ireland could potentially result in over 4.5 billion in potential property claims. So Richard's going to unpack that for us now, talk about the findings and what they'll mean for insurers and communities that will be potentially exposed to this increase in coastal risks. So I'll hand over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah. So as Richard said, this is kind of the key points from the white paper that we published recently. If you want to get your hands on it yourselves and read through it in detail, there's a link on screen there. It's on our website. But what we looked here at really is a couple of things. We're interested in kind of assessing if the construction of buildings over the last number of years has been more flood prone or not. So to do this, we took an extreme event, and what the extreme event itself is it's a 1 in 100 year return coastal flood event. But to that, and following on from what Brandon was saying, we've added in sea level rise. So on top of the 100 year event, we built in this kind of climate change element, which is sea level rise, and we took 1 meter as the value there, which is something that may be expected, as Brandon said, towards the end of the century. But also, Brandon was saying there, we have this surge, extreme surge, and that surge we estimated to add around 75 centimeters based on the number of scientific papers that are included in the IPCC reports. And that storm surge, if you're not familiar with it, does have a number of components. If you have driving onshore wind, it can cause very high waves coming onshore. But also, if you have low atmospheric pressure, a 10 millibar drop in pressure means that obviously there's less air pressure holding the sea down, so it will actually rebound and rise itself. So some of the storms that we've seen recently, Storm Eowyn was down to 940 millibars. That's about 60 or 70 millibars below normal. That alone would be responsible for 60 centimeters of sea level rise. So as the storms get more severe, as climate change is expecting, we can see these millibar levels descending even further. And also then you obviously have tidal patterns. We heard recently that this recent storm event in Middleton and County Cork was a very lucky escape because it happened at low tide. If that had happened at high tide, or if there was a spring tide, which is can raise the sea level more than a meter above normal, the damage in Middleton could have been catastrophic. And obviously the flood depths vary around the coastline. What the map is showing you there is what the flood depth in that extreme event, which has got 75 centimeters above normal due to the storm surge, 1 meter of sea level rise, and the coastal flood event. So you can see along the west coast, especially in bays and estuaries, if you're going up the Shannon Estuary or around Galway Bay and Clew Bay, just because of the topography of those areas, you're seeing 5.5 or above that even meters of water above the normal high water mark. But again, because of storm fetch and the prevailing wind directions and underlying topography off the coast, somewhere like the southeast coast, Wicklow and Wexford there, will actually see much lower levels of extreme events. It could be 2.5 to 3 meters less in an extreme event. But when we analyzed, as I said, we set out to kind of look at what happens in the last 5 years in terms of construction, and our buildings continued to be built in these flood-prone areas. So we looked at the second half, or Q2 Air Code Address database in both 2020 and 2025. So the number of addresses in the database went up by 4.8%. So with 112,000 new buildings or new addresses added to the database. And these, of course, are both residential and commercial. And of these 112,000 new addresses, 4,774 of them were we've assessed to be at risk. This is it actually increases obviously the absolute volume of climate risk that is in the national building stock. So as a proportion of the entire building stock that is at risk, that has gone down very, very slightly. from 4.52 of the building stock in 2020 was at risk, and now that's gone down to 4.50. So obviously, there, you can see there is a lot of construction still happening in these flood-prone areas. And of course, this does not take into account any building level mitigation measures. We also did not take into account any flood defense measures. We leave that for maybe some follow-on research. But you can see it is a significant number of properties at risk. And again, these are, if you look at new builds alone, these are just the buildings that have been added to the air code address, or addresses that have been added to the air code address database in the last 5 years. There are notable concentrations along the northeast coastline. We're seeing in Dublin, there's a big dot there. That's, again, is a lot of development in the Dublin Docklands area, which is a high risk area. There's also some on the Howth Peninsula, moving up to Drogheda and around Dundalk as well. And another area that's also seeing a significant number of new builds in flood-prone areas is along the Shannon Estuary. Again, I should be highlighting here that these individual properties may have mitigation measures as part of the construction. But if we focus on the whole universe of the coastal flood claims in an extreme event, how much is that likely or potentially costing? And this is, again, Richard mentioned at the outset, we're talking the entire universe of potential claims is perhaps as much as 4.5 billion if every single property at risk was to flood. And this is based on a claim size. And again, it's hard to come around these numbers with any level of accuracy. That's something that's going to be for some follow-on research looking at average annual loss from coastal flooding and the like. But if you were to assume a typical flood claim size of 28,000 for residential, 115,000 for commercial, that's where the basis for where these numbers came from. We've also taken into account that some of the buildings are of multi-unit. If you look at multi-unit buildings in the air code address database, they have an average of 6 addresses per building. So again, the assumption here is that, well, we can assume that 3 of them are at risk. Now that may be, that's our best estimate. So again, that those figures do need to be, taken into, that kind of caveat needs to be taken into account. But looking at the exposure, obviously Dublin jumps out because it's got fully 1/3 of the universe of potential claims, because obviously it contains about 1/3 of the population of the entire country. But also Clare, again, this is the Shannon Estuary issue of the very high levels of water coming up the estuary. And also Louth, we saw there in the previous map that there's a lot of low-lying land around Dundalk, which can lead to increased exposure. You may be wondering why Cork is actually down a little bit, but again, a lot of the flood-related issues in County Cork relate not to coastal flooding, but to fluvial and pluvial flooding in that area. We also have Richard mentioned at the very outset, we do maintain a model which can calculate the rebuild cost for single occupancy residential buildings. So if we look at the set of properties that will be under 2.5 meters of seawater, which is likely to lead to a full rebuild, because obviously salt water is incredibly damaging to properties, and any length of inundation is going to potentially lead to the building having to be raised and rebuilt. If we look at, again, it's a more limited number of properties, but the claims in this instance will be much higher, where the building has to be rebuilt from the ground up. And again, it's Dublin and Clare which sees the vast majority out of the 2.2 billion of potential rebuilding. 1.9 of that is in just those 2 counties. And again, there may be some mitigation measures that have been taken at the individual property level. It would be certainly useful to have this modeled to see if we could, use that to model out the potential impact in a bit more detail. So that's again the summary of the white paper. If you are interested, there's a link that has been posted there, which you can click on, and you can actually download the entire paper and read through it yourself. If you do have any questions, I think I'll be happy to answer those. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks for that, Richard. I think we actually do have some questions here. Let me just have a quick look down through them. Actually, one question for you, Richard. Have tidal rivers been modeled in this white paper analysis?
Well, effectively, yes, but it was a fairly simplistic model, one that was not as detailed as what is available from a number of the commercial providers of models. We used open source terrain models and a range of other open source data to build these out. So while it does include those, it doesn't include the additional water that may be in the system based on, say, rain into those rivers. It just assumes that the rivers are at their normal levels and the water will go up them from the surge.
Okay. And then what climate scenario was used? Was it OCP 8.5 that Brandon was talking about?
Not exactly, no. It was a kind of more outcome related rather than an input scenario. But we are, I mean, as Brandon alluded to, we can model sea level rise and storm surges on timelines and in scenarios. So that's ongoing work that we're working on at the moment. We're engaging with that.
Okay, super. These are for Charlotte. What proportion of fires were deliberate versus accidental?
So that was about 11% of fires were recorded as deliberate, just over 1 in 10. So it is definitely a minority, but at the same time, it's not a black swan event. Arson does take place.
Okay, and is it called out as arson, or is it?
No, it is simply recorded as deliberate. So
okay.
we don't have anybody's motivation or anything criminal attached.
And do your findings have any implications for the increasing use of modern methods of construction that utilize timber frame construction?
That is an interesting question, and I'd say it's worth exploring in some depth. It could potentially be a very big question. What I would say is that it's possible and indeed probable that modern building standards the regulations would include suitable measures taken to manage any risks associated with the building materials being used.
Okay. So I think we're getting towards the end. I think that's all the questions we've got that I can see here. First off, just a huge thanks to our speakers for their time and expertise, and to everyone else as well for joining us today. As a reminder, you will receive the recording and additional resources via email, probably in the next little while. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can contact us through LinkedIn on the Gamma Risk page, or some of the details are there on the screen as well. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.